Hello and welcome back to Mystical Wisdom. This is the second video that I'm making on the topic of archetypes. So if you haven't watched the previous episode, where I talked about archetypes generally, and I also wrote a blog about archetypes, then make sure you catch up with that because they kind of fall in a pattern, a sequence. Now, this topic is archetypes in astrology. And the blog that goes with it goes into a lot more depth, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview. Astrology is a subject, a fascinating subject, very ancient, that has been handed down to us in the Western tradition for at least a couple of thousand years. Some of the earliest texts for Western astrology go back to just before the time of Christ. However, it was much older tradition going back further than that to the time of the Babylonian astronomers who were working, 1,000 years before that even. So what we've inherited in astrology describes various archetypes and also describes how the archetypes can appear in different guises. So if you know anything about astrology at all, this won't be new to you, but let me just do a quick rain check. In those ancient times, a couple of thousand years ago, when the Western astrology, what's sometimes now called Hellenistic astrology, was developed and recorded in texts that people have been translating in very recent times. At that time, of course, people could not see the outer planets. They could only see as far as Saturn, although they could see stars, fixed stars as well. But they've concentrated on those 7 heavenly bodies, the planets, the moon, and the sun. And those are the fundamental archetypes that we can find when we look at an astrological chart. Those are the most significant ones when it comes to thinking about your personal life, right? The outer planets are a bit of another story, and we'll come to them at a later date. So it's really significant for you to discover something about the activity of those planetary archetypes or gods at the time when you were born, because that means you have come into a kind of arena, a landscape, if you like. You could call it a karmic landscape. That means that those particular gods and archetypes are working in a particular way at the moment that you were born. Then the moment that you were born, lots of other things were going on as well. But from your personal perspective, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at especially those 7. And in the blog article, I go into a bit more detail about them, but you probably know them: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And some of them are considered goody-goodies, and some of them are considered not so nice. Right? Some of them come in on the side of love and some on the side of strife, as they call it in the Greek philosophy. But they all have an opportunity to dress up in different ways. Think of them as actors in a play. So the actors can all dress up in different ways and appear in your life as certain events or certain people even that have a particular contact with who you are, right? So let me take an example. In my chart, this is a bit of a revealing of personal stuff. I have the planet Venus dressed up in the zodiac sign of Pisces, right? So those are the 12 zodiac signs are the costumes we're talking about. So Venus, famously in traditional astrology, Venus is called exalted in Pisces. She really loves to be in Pisces. It's a nice, soft, gentle, spiritual sign, and Venus can feel very special there, right? So she has a particular way of being in the world because she's got that costume on. Now, there are other costumes that Venus might put on which might not actually be so comforting, right? Venus is about how we relate to each other. What if Venus puts on the costume of the sign of Scorpio? What do you know about the sign of Scorpio? It doesn't have a very cosy reputation. In fact, it has a reputation for being quite pokey, if you like. It's a sign that's ruled by the planet Mars, who's the planet of division, separation. And there's Venus, who wants to be all friendly and cosy, stuck with a costume that's perhaps got rather spiky edges to it in some way, not very cosy. But maybe she can do some good work there. So whatever costume one of the archetypal planets puts on, it's got the capacity to do a good job for you. And you need to take charge of them. This is why it's so important to get to know your astrological chart. Do it with a very simple online chart computer, because even if you don't have your own software, there are really high quality online sites out there where you can find out exactly what you need to know from this perspective. If you don't know your time of birth, then you may have a problem knowing what sign the moon is in, because the moon can change signs very quickly. Actually, even the sun, as it changes over, can change from the morning being in one sign to the evening being in another sign. So having at least a rough idea of the time of day that you were born is really helpful. Then you can identify all those gods that I mentioned in the blog, and then you can identify which signs of the zodiac they've put on for their costumes, right? And how effective they might be in your life. And if they're not going to be effective, you need to consider what you're going to do about that, because every chart has got opportunities in it. It's rather like having a hand of cards. When you've got a hand of cards in a poker game or any other competitive game, it's to do with strategy as much as it is to do with what the cards actually are. Because you are dealt some cards, and that's like your horoscope. That's what you've got. But taking charge of how the game goes is another challenge altogether. And I'll remind you that in the last video on this subject, I mentioned the word metis, which is a Greek word meaning trickery. But it's trickery more like wizardry or wisdom. It's knowing how to play the game, knowing that it is a game, and that you can take the winner's seat if you handle what you've been given competently. And your competence will grow the more you understand about the archetypes, which is why astrology is so important, but also why you can work with archangels, because archangels measure up to, or match up to, some of the archetypes represented by the gods, and they can open the gates for you to develop certain capacities, and they are like gateways to different levels of consciousness. And I shall be talking about that in a bit more depth in the next video and in the next blog. So don't forget, read the blog that goes with this, because there's some good instructions and very helpful stuff in it, and links that will lead you to finding a chart for yourself if you haven't got one. And also there's some detail in it about the relationship between those planetary gods and your inner landscape. And I think that will be really helpful for you on your spiritual quest. I'll be back again with another video on the topic of the archetypes, the astrology, and the archangels, and how they all start blending into one way of looking at things. Many blessings, keep shining, and I'll be back.